What if the same lesson keeps returning because America keeps refusing to learn? That question hit me one night like a weight on my chest, heavy enough to stop my breath for a second, and as I sat there, thinking about everything my people had lived through, I felt that old familiar tremble in my spirit, the one that whispers, "Here we go again." Welcome, I'm Simmons, and you're watching Chronicles of Black. If you're here with me, make sure you subscribe, because these stories, our stories, deserve to be heard. And tell me in the comments what this moment means to you, because every voice matters in this conversation. I grew up hearing tales that weren't written in any school book, stories carried in quiet voices at kitchen tables, passed from my grandparents to my parents, then placed in my hands like a torch. Stories about how a black person could do everything right, work hard, stay humble, keep their head down and still find themselves crushed under someone else's idea of who they were supposed to be. And even as time moved, the echoes of those old wounds never disappeared. They just changed shape. There's a belief whispered in our communities, one that feels older than any church, sermon, or history lesson. The idea that when a country keeps ignoring the truth, the universe will shake it awake. Not gently, not softly, but in a way nobody can turn away from, almost like a storm that rises out of nowhere, tearing through the silence. Jordan Carter understood that storm better than most. He wasn't a famous man. He wasn't a politician, a preacher, or a celebrity. He was a school counselor in a small city where the buildings needed paint and the kids needed hope. Middle-aged, tired-eyed, but still holding on to something inside him that refused to give up. Every day, he listened to children carry the same pain he had once carried. Kids being told they fit a description. Kids being followed in stores. Kids being punished twice as hard for half the mistakes. And sometimes he wondered if the system was designed to break them before they even grew. Jordan used to think progress meant slow but steady change. But then the air shifted. The country started humming with a strange tension. Conversations that used to stay quiet suddenly spilled out loud. And when Donald Trump rose to political power, that hum turned into a crack, splitting the country right down the middle. Jordan watched it happen in real time. Neighbors who once smiled politely started saying things they used to only think. People online, people at work, people in his own family circles suddenly felt bold enough to speak in ways they'd never had before. And it wasn't new. None of it was new. But the confidence behind it, that was new. Some folks said racism was dying. Jordan knew better. It wasn't dying. It was shifting, waiting, and now it was stepping right back out into the light like it never left. For a long time, America pretended the beast was gone. But Jordan saw it every day in suspended students, in scared parents, in the way police cars took the long route through certain neighborhoods. And now that beast wasn't hiding. It was roaring. Jordan sat on the edge of his bed one morning, tying his shoes, looking at the news on the small screen in the corner of the room. The cameras showed crowds cheering, people chanting, arguments boiling over in the streets. And for the first time in years, he felt the same cold chill he'd felt as a teenager when a police officer grabbed his friend, for no reason other than the color of his skin. As all of this unfolded, a strange question started forming in his mind. A question he didn't say out loud, not at first. He wondered whether this moment, this era, was really just politics, or if it was something deeper, something older, something that had been building for decades, maybe centuries. Was it coincidence, or was it consequence? Because when a nation keeps shoving the truth aside, eventually, the truth shows up in a way nobody can ignore. Jordan didn't know the answer yet, but he could feel the ground beneath him changing, and he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was coming next wasn't coming quietly. Jordan didn't need the news to tell him the country had changed. He could feel it the moment he stepped out his front door. The air felt sharper, like something in it had been cut open. Neighbors who used to wave now muttered lines they picked up from somebody else, repeating them like they were facts carved in stone. Words that once hid behind polite smiles were now thrown around casually, like permission had finally been granted to say what had always lived beneath the surface. He'd hear it at the grocery store, at the gas station, at staff meetings where people pretended they were just joking, even though everyone knew they weren't. And it wasn't the shock that hit Jordan the hardest. It was the exhaustion, the kind of tired that sits deep in your bones and makes you wonder how many times a country can repeat the same mistake before it finally learns. At his school, the shift was even more painful. Students walked with their heads down, gripping backpacks tighter, whispering about things they heard grown-ups say the night before. Some didn't want to walk home anymore. They said cars slowed down beside them longer than usual. They said people stared too hard. They said they didn't feel safe, not because of anything they did, but because of what they looked like. One girl, 12 years old, pulled Jordan aside and asked him if she was too dark to be liked by her teacher. Another boy told him he was followed around a store until he left in tears. These weren't news stories. Jordan had lived through the same things, but hearing them now, in this climate, felt different. Like the country wasn't even pretending to hide the truth anymore. Coworkers who used to keep their real opinions buried deep started letting them spill out in plain sight. One man said he wished things could go back to how they were. Another complained that people make everything about race. Jordan watched their faces as they spoke. He saw the comfort in their expressions, the ease with which they dismissed pain they never had to carry, and he realized they weren't slipping up. They weren't losing control. They were revealing themselves. For years, white America had the privilege of ignoring the mirror. They could walk past it, tell themselves racism was over, pretend the cracks in the country weren't there. But now, the mirror was too big, too bright, too loud. Every flaw, every lie about fairness, every wound black people had learned to hide, just to survive, it was all out in the open. The spotlight didn't ask permission, it simply showed the truth. Jordan had lived long enough to understand something important. A system doesn't break on accident. It breaks when it rots from the inside, when the truth becomes too heavy to hide. And this moment, this era, forced the country to look straight at the thing it had tried to bury. People would argue about politics, about speeches, about policies, but Jordan saw something else. Something deeper. He saw a symbol resenya, a reflection of everything America swore it had left behind. Trump wasn't just a man or a leader. He became the loudspeaker for the thoughts some people kept locked away, the thoughts they claimed didn't exist. He became the spotlight that revealed the wounds black people carried in silence. Jordan didn't view it as destiny or fate. He viewed it as exposure. A harsh, unfiltered exposure of a truth old as the nation itself. Every night, after long days of listening, comforting, and trying to steady the hearts of children who deserved better, Jordan sat at his kitchen table with a notebook. He didn't write stories or speeches. He wrote fragments, pieces of emotion he couldn't say out loud. Words that came from the place inside him where pain and patience lived side by side. He wrote about the fear he saw in their eyes. He wrote about the anger simmering across the country. He wrote about the lies America had been telling itself for generations. And he wrote about the strange feeling that all this unmasking, had been building for a long time. Some nights his hand shook as he wrote, not from fear, but from a quiet, simmering rage he'd learned to carry with dignity. Rage that came from watching an entire country pretend truth was a myth until it climbed out of the shadows and stood in the center of the room. Jordan didn't know where the storm was heading, but he knew it wasn't done. Not yet. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs low like it's waiting for something terrible to happen. Jordan was sorting through papers in his office when his phone buzzed. The look on the principal's face told him everything before he even read the message. One of his boys, 16-year-old Malik, a kid he'd been mentoring since middle school, had been arrested. Not for anything he did, for something someone else assumed. They said Malik matched a description. Jordan had heard those words too many times in his life. They were the same words that had stolen years, futures, and sometimes lives. He rushed to the police station, hoping it was a mistake, praying it was a misunderstanding that would clear up in minutes. But when he arrived, he saw Malik sitting behind a glass window, hands shaking, fear stretched across his face like he didn't know whether to cry or disappear. Jordan felt something in him crack, not dramatically, not loudly, just a small, sharp break somewhere deep inside, the kind that never fully heals. News spread fast. Parents, students, neighbors, everyone heard. Outrage spilled through the streets, not as noise, but as a heavy grief layered with anger. People gathered outside the station, demanding answers, demanding fairness, demanding the thing they'd been denied over and over again. Later that night, Jordan drove to Malik's house. The boy's mother, Vanessa, opened the door with red eyes and a trembling jaw. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just stood there like a woman who'd carried too much for too long. They sat at her kitchen table, the same place where she once told Jordan about Malik's dreams. College, engineering, building something real in this world. Tonight, those dreams felt fragile, like glass held over concrete. Vanessa leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm done pretending this place is what they say it is," she said. "I'm done acting like we're safe just because we smile and follow the rules." Jordan didn't try to comfort her with promises. He didn't tee off her cliches or hopeful lines he didn't fully believe. He just held her hand, letting her know she wasn't alone in the hurt, because he felt it too. Every word she spoke hit him like a truth he'd been trying not to say himself. Outside, the city was changing. People were gathering on corners, arguing, shouting, marching. You could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to taste. It wasn't just anger, it was a realization shared by thousands of voices all at once. Something was wrong, and it had been wrong for a long time. But tonight, nobody was willing to swallow it quietly. Jordan felt pulled in two directions. Part of him felt trapped in despair, sinking in the belief that nothing would ever change, that every generation would face the same cycle of pain. But another part of him, a part he hadn't heard in years, felt something awakening, a fire, a spark, a sense that the louder the hate grew, the harder it became for people to ignore the truth. He started noticing faces in the crowd he didn't expect. White neighbors who'd always stayed silent now stood with their signs raised high, voices firm, eyes fierce. Teachers who usually kept their heads down walked beside parents demanding justice. Young people who once said racism wasn't real now saw it with their own eyes and they refused to look away. For the first time, the silence that protected the lie was breaking. And in that break, Jordan saw something he never thought he'd witness. People who once looked past the pain now, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who carried it daily. That night, Jordan sat in his car for a long time before heading home. The streets were loud, but underneath all the shouting, he heard something else. A truth rising. A truth refusing to be buried. He pulled out his notebook and wrote slowly, letting the words come the way they wanted. This pain is real. This fear is real. But maybe this moment, this chaos, is the only way the truth can finally be seen. He closed the notebook and leaned his head back. The world felt like it was shaken, and maybe it needed to. Maybe this was the confrontation everyone had spent decades avoiding. Painful, raw, necessary. Jordan didn't know how the story would end, but for the first time, he felt like the truth had finally stepped out from behind the curtain, and it wasn't going back in. Jordan woke up the next morning with a heaviness in his chest, the kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep but from too much truth. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, and out of nowhere, a memory of his grandmother floated into his mind. She had a way of speaking that cut through everything. No fancy words, no soft edges. Just truth. When a wound refuses to heal, she used to say, God will open it again so you can clean it out. Back then, he never understood what she meant. He thought wounds were supposed to stay closed, hidden, forgotten. But now watching the country unravel in front of him, her words hit him like they were meant for this exact moment. The punishment wasn't destruction. It wasn't fire. It wasn't revenge. It was something much harder to face. Exposure. That was the real reckoning. America wasn't being torn apart for no reason. It was being forced to face the infection it kept pretending wasn't there. All the things that were whispered in back rooms, hidden behind coded language, buried under polite smiles, now they were out in the open, staring everyone in the face with no way to look away. Jordan drove through the city that morning and saw something he'd never seen before. Not the anger that was always there. Not the fear that too was familiar. What he saw was clarity. A clarity that didn't belong to only one group. People who once argued that racism was exaggerated now stood frozen, watching videos, hearing stories, witnessing moments they couldn't explain away. He saw confusion on their faces, the kind that comes when denial no longer works. For years, black people had been saying, "This is happening." For years, others responded, "Are you sure?" Now the answer was right in front of them, louder than every excuse. Jordan thought about Malik, about Vanessa's trembling whisper, about the students walking with caution in their own neighborhoods. None of this was new. The only new thing was how impossible it had become to hide. The illusion of equality, the claim that progress had fixed everything, the belief that America had moved beyond its past, those illusions were collapsing fast. Sometimes, the truth doesn't rise gently. Sometimes, it erupts. Jordan felt anger. Yes. The kind that sits behind the ribs and pushes against every breath. But he also felt something else in understanding. A realization he didn't want but couldn't deny. The era they were living through wasn't random chaos. It was a mirror. A brutal, unforgiving mirror held up to a country that had spent decades avoiding its own reflection. Trump didn't create racism. He didn't invent hate. He didn't build the system that crushed childhoods and exhausted generations. What he did, whether intentional or not, was reveal it. He dragged the truth from the shadows and placed it under a spotlight bright enough for the entire world to see. People who once said systemic racism was just an excuse, now admitted they noticed it everywhere: schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, hospitals, courtrooms. The things black voices had been shouting for decades had turned into echoes that finally reached ears that never wanted to hear them. The veil was gone. Jordan knew there was no going back now. You can't unsee the truth once it's been revealed. And as painful as the moment was, he understood why it had to happen. If a wound stays closed, the infection grows. If the infection grows, the body breaks. And if the body breaks, there's nothing left to save. This wasn't destruction. It was revelation, a cleansing that came with fire, honesty, and discomfort. Jordan sat in his car outside the school, watching students walk in with heavy steps. He whispered to himself, almost like he was speaking to his grandmother again. I get it now. I finally get it. The storm they were living through wasn't just an era of division. It was the moment the truth demanded to be seen. The moment America's oldest wound split open again, not to destroy the country, but to give it one last chance to heal the right way. And Jordan knew he wasn't the only one who finally understood that. The weeks that follow feel different, charged, awake, unfiltered. Across the country, communities begin to organize with a seriousness that wasn't there before. No more surface-level conversations. No more pretending. People sit in living rooms, in church basements, in community centers, and ask the hard questions they once avoided. Real pressure builds. Real accountability forms. Real change feels possible. For the first time, long-protected policies get questioned. Old systems once untouchable now tremble under scrutiny. Voices that were ignored for generations are finally being heard without interruption. And something even bigger happens. More Americans, from every background, begin to understand the black struggle, not as a black issue, but as a national truth woven into the foundation of the country. The story shifts from isolated pain to collective responsibility. Jordan steps into a new role he never saw coming. He starts mentoring young leaders, bold, brilliant, unafraid to speak loudly. They remind him of who he once was, and who he still can be. Their fire gives him hope. Their courage makes him believe that all the chaos, all the conflict, All the exposure had a purpose. He realizes the storm wasn't meant to break people. It was meant to reveal everything America tried to hide. Silence had consequences. Avoidance had consequences. And now, truth is standing front and center, demanding to be acknowledged. Poetic justice, Jordan finally understands, doesn't come from revenge. It comes from truth so undeniable it forces a nation to confront itself. And in that truth, he sees the first signs of real transformation. Jordan stands outside the school, where he pours his heart into the next generation. The morning air is calm, but his voice carries weight as he speaks to the students gathered around him. He tells them that every generation is handed a moment, one moment where everything changes. This, he says softly, was ours, and what you choose to do with it will shape what comes next. He explains that real strength doesn't come from comfort or silence. Strength comes from clarity, and clarity came from the painful, chaotic years the country had just endured, years that stripped away every excuse, every illusion, every denial. Jordan looks at their faces, some hopeful, some unsure, all listening, and he feels something ignite in him, a new fire, a deeper purpose. He finally understands that the universe doesn't ignore injustice. It just works differently than people expect, slow when it needs to teach, steady when the world resists, and loud when truth demands to be heard. He vows to keep fighting, to keep teaching, to keep speaking truth even when it shakes the room. And before he sends the students off, he leaves them and the audience with a challenge. Ask yourself what role you're meant to play, because the future isn't written by those who stay silent, it's shaped by those who dare to stand up. The story closes on a powerful truth. Once exposed, truth cannot be buried again. Not by politics, not by fear, not by time. The fire has been lit, and this time, it won't go out.